Welcome back to the deep dive. It's hard to believe this is actually our 10th deep dive already. We're jumping right into it with a really urgent situation that's developing in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We've been following some pretty alarming reports, actually, from the Associated Press and Al Jazeera, and they're painting a very stark picture of this escalating conflict, especially in the eastern part of the country, specifically in Goma.
Yeah, it's a situation that's deteriorating very rapidly. The M23 rebels have taken control of Goma,
Wow.
and it's a city of 2 million people. This group, the M23 rebels, are known for committing human rights abuses, and their takeover of Goma has caused this massive exodus of residents. There's a very real fear that this could spark a wider regional war.
Yeah, that sounds extremely serious. To give our listener a little more background on what's happening and why, can you tell us more about these M23 rebels?
Sure. The M23 is a rebel group, predominantly Tutsi, and they actually broke away from the Congolese army over a decade ago, back in 2012. And get this, they actually captured Goma briefly that year, but they withdrew under international pressure. They've resurfaced, and their latest offensive seems, I don't know, maybe even more strategic and potentially even more brutal.
It's chilling to think that they've actually done this before.
Yeah.
And from what I've been reading, Rwanda seems to be playing a really significant role in all of this. Both the Congolese government and the UN experts are directly accusing Rwanda of backing the M23.
Hmm.
And they're citing evidence of Rwandan troops and weapons actually being present in Congo. But on the other hand, Rwanda is denying any involvement.
Right. Rwanda's offering a completely different perspective. They're denying providing any support to these rebels and claiming that their troops are only in Congo to protect Rwanda's security. They even go so far as to say that the DRC is the one that actually triggered this recent escalation. So
Yeah.
it just adds another layer of complexity to an already very volatile situation.
It's certainly a tangled web of claims and counterclaims. But let's get back to what this actually means for the people on the ground. You mentioned this mass exodus from Goma. What does that look like? I mean, how are people actually coping with this situation?
It's really heartbreaking. There's this one story in the AP article about a Goma resident, Chibalanza Habimana, and she decided to stay home with her family even though there's fighting going on around them.
Why would you do that?
Because they have nowhere else to go. Millions of people were already displaced in eastern Congo before this happened, and now with Goma falling, that number is just going to skyrocket.
It's hard to imagine the kind of fear and desperation that these families are facing. And it sounds like this situation could really spiral out of control. What are the chances that this conflict spreads beyond Congo's borders?
The potential for this conflict to engulf the whole region is very real. Already there have been deaths among the UN peacekeepers and soldiers from the Southern African Development Community Mission. They're trying to keep some order there, but
Yeah. So those who are trying to keep the peace are becoming victims themselves.
it's tragic.
It's a tragedy. And then there's the economic impact to consider, which I imagine could have ripple effects way beyond Congo.
For sure. Eastern Congo is extremely rich in minerals that are essential for global industries. We're talking smartphones, electric cars, you name it. And this conflict could disrupt those supply chains, sending shockwaves through the global economy and, well, possibly fueling even more instability.
So as we're talking, the world is watching this unfold. And I'm curious, what has the international response to this crisis been so far?
Well, the DRC has cut off diplomatic ties with Rwanda,
Wow.
and they're calling for UN sanctions against Rwanda. The UN Security Council has condemned the M23 advance, and they've called for the withdrawal of all these external forces. But there are some diplomatic efforts underway, with Kenya stepping in, trying to get the DRC and Rwanda to the table. They're pushing for an emergency summit to de-escalate things.
So there are some, I guess you could call them glimmers of hope for some kind of diplomacy here. But given the deep mistrust and the completely conflicting narratives, what do you think? Is there any realistic chance for a lasting peace in eastern Congo?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that we're going to dig into even further as we continue our deep dive today. That really is the question, isn't it? How to achieve lasting peace in a region that's been riddled with conflict for so long. It's important to keep in mind that the M23 rebels are just one piece of this huge puzzle.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's easy to just focus on the latest crisis and miss that bigger picture. Can you kind of paint that picture for us? Like, what's the context here?
Well, Eastern Congo has been dealing with instability, violence, armed conflict for decades. This isn't a sudden explosion. It's more like this chronic condition that just keeps flaring up. And there are so many armed groups, each with their own agendas and loyalties.
So what's driving this ongoing instability? Is it mostly ethnic tensions, or is there more to it than that?
I mean, ethnic tensions definitely play a part, but it's not the whole story. You have to remember, this region is incredibly rich in mineral resources, the kind that power our smartphones, our electric cars, everything. And that abundance, combined with a weak central government, well, it creates this breeding ground for conflict. These armed groups are fighting for control of those mines, exploiting the people, and the cycle just keeps going.
So we're all implicated in this conflict in a way. Every time we upgrade our phones, we're feeding the demand that's driving this violence.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. The global demand for these minerals has a very real impact on people's lives in Eastern Congo. It shows us how these seemingly distant conflicts can actually have consequences that touch all of us.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the search for peace then. We've talked about diplomacy and the UN peacekeeping mission, but are there any other initiatives that are aimed at, you know, bringing some stability to the region?
There are, and I think it's important to talk about the work being done by people at the grassroots level. Local communities are often the ones leading the charge for reconciliation, organizing peace talks, trying to heal those wounds from the conflict. And there are regional efforts too, like the East African community, which is working to foster more cooperation and dialogue between neighboring countries.
So it sounds like there's a multi-layered approach to peace building, everything from international diplomacy to community-based initiatives. But with so much distrust and a history of broken promises, do you think lasting peace is even possible?
It's a tough road, there's no question. But I refuse to believe that peace is impossible. I think it requires a fundamental shift in how we approach conflict resolution, moving away from these short-term interventions and looking more towards long-term solutions.
What would those long-term solutions actually look like? What needs to change to break this cycle of violence?
Well, it starts with addressing the root causes of the conflict. That means dealing with poverty, improving governance, and making sure that the wealth from those resources benefits the Congolese people. And it also means holding everyone accountable for human rights abuses, no matter who they are.
Accountability, that's a powerful word. It seems like impunity has been a real problem in the past.
Absolutely. If those who commit violence think they can get away with it, they have no reason to change. And that's why it's so important for the international community to put on the pressure, to impose sanctions when needed, and to really support the Congolese people in their search for justice.
And what about the UN peacekeeping mission? They've been in Congo for over 20 years. What's their role in all of this?
Well, the UN mission, it's called MONUSCO, has this challenging mandate. They're supposed to protect civilians, support the peace process, and help stabilize the country. But they've been criticized for not doing enough to prevent the violence, and their presence obviously hasn't stopped this latest escalation.
It sounds like an impossible job, to be honest. They're caught in the middle of everything, both literally and figuratively. The AP article mentioned Congolese soldiers actually surrendering to the UN peacekeepers.
Right.
What does that tell us about the state of the Congolese army?
Well, it points to a problem that's been there for a long time. The Congolese army itself has been dealing with corruption, ineffectiveness, and even human rights abuses within its own ranks. So that makes it incredibly difficult for them to effectively fight against these armed groups in the East.
So if the Congolese army is actually part of the problem, can a military approach ever really bring peace to Eastern Congo? It seems like a contradiction.
You're absolutely right. A purely military approach just won't work. We need a broader strategy that takes into account the political, economic, and social factors that are driving this conflict.
It's about getting to the root of the problem, creating a system where violence is no longer a viable option for anyone. It sounds like a long and difficult journey, but the only way to achieve lasting peace. It feels like we're seeing a real range of reactions from the international community to this crisis. It's almost like everyone's looking at the same thing, but through a different lens.
Yeah, you're right. And that just goes to show how complicated this situation really is. You've got the UN Security Council issuing condemnations, calling for sanctions. Then you've got regional players like Kenya trying to play the mediator role. It's like a big diplomatic dance. Everyone's trying to figure out their part and how they can have the most influence.
And then you have this back and forth between the DRC and Rwanda, both with completely different stories.
Exactly.
The DRC is pointing the finger at Rwanda, accusing them of aggression,
Right.
while Rwanda is denying everything, putting the blame back on the DRC for not dealing with the root causes of the conflict. It feels like a dangerous stalemate.
It is. It really is. It's this blame game. And the really sad part is that while all this political maneuvering is happening, it's the people of Goma, the everyday citizens, that are caught in the middle.
Yeah. Their lives are being turned upside down. Their futures are completely uncertain. It's a reminder that behind all these geopolitical games, there are real human lives at stake.
Mm.
And speaking of those caught in the middle, we've talked about MONUSCO, the UN peacekeeping mission, and they've been in Congo for decades now. But with the rising casualties, it makes you wonder, are they actually making any difference?
That's a question people have been asking for years. MONUSCO is one of the largest and most expensive peacekeeping operations in the world, with this enormous responsibility to protect civilians, support peace efforts, and help stabilize the country. But the reality on the ground is that it's incredibly tough. They're often outmatched by the armed groups. They just don't have the resources or the ability to do everything that's asked of them.
And these recent deaths, they just show how dangerous this work is. The AP article mentioned Congolese soldiers actually surrendering to the peacekeepers. So if even a Congolese army can't hold their own, is there really any hope for peace?
It's a really good question, and it highlights a problem that's been around for a long time. The Congolese army itself has been plagued with corruption, a lack of effectiveness, and even human rights abuses within its own ranks. It's really hard to build peace when the institution that's supposed to be providing security is part of the problem.
It all feels so overwhelming. Is there any reason to be hopeful? Is there any way out of this cycle of violence that seems endless?
I know, it's easy to feel that way. It's easy to get lost in the despair. But I think we have to remember that even in the middle of all this chaos and heartbreak, there are seeds of hope being planted. The work that local peace organizations are doing, the people who are bravely speaking out against injustice, those who are fighting for a better future, those are the things that give me hope.
You said earlier that lasting peace requires a fundamental shift in our approach. What does that actually look like?
It means we have to stop looking for those quick fixes and start investing in solutions that will have a real impact in the long term. It means tackling the root causes of this conflict, things like poverty and inequality, making sure that the people of Congo benefit from the wealth of their own country. It means giving power back to local communities, strengthening the government, and creating a culture where people are held accountable for their actions.
Accountability seems to be a really key word here. Holding people responsible for the violence, no matter who they are.
Yes, exactly. Impunity has been a huge barrier to peace for way too long. And this is where the rest of the world needs to step up. Putting pressure on those in power, imposing sanctions if necessary, and supporting the Congolese people in their pursuit of justice. Those are the concrete actions we can take to try and stop this cycle of violence.
So there's a lot of work to do, both within Congo and in the international community.
Yeah.
What can our listener do? We've talked about this incredibly complex conflict, but what can one person do to actually make a difference?
I get asked that a lot, and it's tempting to say that individual actions are just a drop in the bucket when we're facing something this big. But I really do believe that every voice matters. Every act of solidarity can have a ripple effect.
So what can our listeners do right now to get involved? Give us some examples.
The first step is really simple but important. Stay informed. Don't turn away from the news, even when it's hard to hear. Learn about the conflict, talk about it with your friends and family, and be part of the conversation. Raising awareness is crucial.
Knowledge is power. So beyond staying informed, what else can our listener do to make a real difference?
Supporting the organizations that are doing the work on the ground is another incredibly powerful way to get involved. There are so many humanitarian organizations that are providing aid to the people who have been displaced by the conflict. And there are groups working on peace building, human rights, and sustainable development. Even a small donation can have a big impact.
So educate ourselves, donate to organizations doing good work. It's about putting our knowledge and our resources into action. Anything else our listener can do to amplify their impact?
Definitely. Don't underestimate the power of getting involved politically. Contact your elected officials, tell them to make this conflict a priority and to hold those responsible for human rights abuses accountable. Make your voice heard, demand action from those who have the power to make a difference.
So it's a multi-pronged approach, staying informed, supporting those working to make a difference, and getting involved in the political process. It's a reminder that we're not helpless in the face of these tragedies.
Exactly. The situation in Eastern Congo is heartbreaking, but we can't afford to be indifferent. Even small acts of solidarity and engagement can help create a more peaceful future for the Congolese people.
That's a really powerful message to end on. This has been a tough but incredibly important deep dive into the crisis in eastern Congo. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and insights.
Thank you for having me. It's been great to be here and to have the chance to shed some light on this critical issue.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We'll continue to follow the situation in the region and keep you updated. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and remember that your voice matters.